I really hope that people do ask questions, because this definitely will not be a 50-minute presentation. So anyway, my name is Peter Piekarczyk, and today I'll be talking about Reason and the future of React. Just a show of hands, do people here write Reason or React on a normal basis? Any one of those two? Okay, cool, awesome. Anyway, my last name is Piekarczyk, and an easy way to remember that is pies, cars, and chicks. And that's because I'm Polish, so it's technically pronounced Piekarczyk, but I won't hold you accountable for that. Anyway, I'm from Chicago. I love to cycle. I'm a huge fan of ReasonML, obviously, which is why I'm here today. I love Expo and React Native. I'm actually Expo's first user, so I've been using it for a long time and love the ecosystem. I love plants, too. Every time I travel, I have an Instagram just full of plant pics. So if you've got great places with great plants, please let me know. I'm a Y Combinator alum, and I'm the co-founder of Draftbit. If you haven't heard of Draftbit, I have to tell you all a story for how we've sort of realized that Reason was the right thing for us, right? So a little backstory. Draftbit is a way to build mobile apps visually, specifically Expo and React Native apps. And the process is simple. You scan a QR code, you drag some components over, and you export that code. So we give you access to all the source code, right? We build on top of the React Native and Expo infrastructure and ecosystem to just make it all one step easier. And we do that by putting it in the browser. So you go to build.draftbit.com, right? You scan your QR code. In this case, I've got the simulator running on the side for demo purposes. And you just drag and drop. And this is a quick demo of what we're going to be talking about and why Reason made this whole thing a lot easier. So in this case, we're putting together a simple push notification screen, right? Just on any onboarding step, you've got a big image, you've got some text, and then you've got the enable or skip buttons, right? So what we do is we drag over two buttons, right? We update the labels to say skip and enable. We remove the icons, and then we set justify content space between and push those things down, right? And in this UI, you can see a lot going on, right? We've got the navigator on the left-hand side. We've got the layer tree. We've got the phone frame in the middle running WebAssembly, which is nuts. And then we've got the config editor on the right-hand side, right? So a lot of different state to manage. A lot of different things are happening, right? And the whole goal of Draftbit is to be able to build real-world complex apps. This isn't a toy. We're constantly pushing ourselves to build things that people would want, to build things that we would want, right? So we started off with building Airbnb clones and Instagram clones, to starting a little consulting thing called Draftbit Studios, where we just take on small projects to just dog food our own product, right? The whole point is just to make this experience better. Now, in the grand scheme of things, there's a lot going on, right? And we have Reason and JavaScript mixed out throughout the whole project, right? So this layers panel was JavaScript as of 3 days ago, but is now all Reason. We're running this phone frame, which is Yoga, WebAssembly, and Reason. Our live preview and code generation all takes place on the client. That's all Reason too. We wrote a whole compiler in the browser, and we weren't able to do it without something as fast and as nice as what Reason has to offer. Our configuration on the right-hand side started off as being solely JavaScript, but as we created new modules, new components, things like an image picker, asset uploader, right? All the various things like carousels and buttons that your app needs, right? All the configuration settings, we slowly started moving over to Reason for that too. And it's not like this stuff was hard. We weren't going uphill to make these changes. These changes were downhill, right? It made our lives easier. All these little things here, are mixed between JavaScript and Reason. And because we're a startup, right? We always want to build these amazing, amazing pieces of art when it comes to engineering, but it never looks that way, right? I think no matter how young or old you are, as a company, you ultimately end up starting with a pueblo in the desert and then putting steel reinforcements around that to keep this shit together, right? And that's basically our relationship with JavaScript and Reason. And we needed to move fast to survive, right? So what we were doing is we were building and cranking out features in JavaScript, right? But what happens after a while? You pick up a ton of technical debt. Things start to break down. Errors get caught in promises, right? And you just kind of have to take a step back and ask yourself, like, what are we doing, right? So one of those ways to fix that is just to work around the clock to do it, right? As a founder, that's sort of been my life, right? But like as a team, that's not a reality, right? So we're constantly trying to push the boundaries of what engineering has to offer to make those things easier. And so we gave Reason a shot, and we never looked back, right? And what does that Draftbit stack look like now? Well, I believe this is the right stack for an early stage company that really wants to move quickly without picking up too much technical debt. So that's React and Reason. Maybe not the WebAssembly part. Forget that. You shouldn't be using WebAssembly as a young company. Expo, GraphQL, Apollo, and Postgres, right? And are we familiar with GraphQL and Apollo here? Or at least, to the point of, so GraphQL is sort of this new thing for REST, right? Instead of having individual endpoints for your resources, you define the way the data needs to look on the client. And then the API or whatever figures out how to fetch that data and give it to you, right? So it's made our lives easier. It's cut about 30% of the code off from the server and about 70% of the code on the client, right? So think about loading, errors, success states for each of your things, or keeping that in Redux or whatever, right? The more code you have, the higher chances of picking up technical debt and shipping bugs to production, right? So in that same vein, we've been writing less code with Reason, and it's helped us ship less bugs. So like I mentioned, we all used to start with JavaScript, especially our juniors, our newcomers, people who are onboarding in the stack. I was the first person using Reason, and I wasn't making anybody use it. You know what I mean? I'm a pretty nice guy. So I'm like, you can use JavaScript if you want, right? You'll get there. You'll make your way towards Reason, right? And then a lot of this started happening, like, I don't fucking like this, JavaScript is hard, right? No matter if you're a junior or a senior, been writing JavaScript for 5 months or 5 years or 15, right? You will make mistakes, and it sucks, right? So a lot of times we would have conversations like, hey, Peter. I'm like, yeah, I think I broke something. All right, let's take a look. 15 minutes and 10 console.logs later, we fucking misspelled the URL, right, in some file, right? Like, that's not a junior mistake. That's a human mistake. It happens to the best of us, right? All right, now let's talk about what our ecosystem as a whole looks like, right? Remember life before 2015? Remember like the index.html file with like a script tag in it, like before CSS hovers were a thing, right? Like how nice was like jQuery and Angular? Remember, I was like happy back then, like life wasn't bad, right? Like, it was just kind of this like retro phase of our lives, right? Just like things were good, right? And then it all just fucking went downhill, right? We got React in 2013. We're like, we have to be using this. This is the shit, right? This is the future, and then like with React came Babel, and then Flux, and with Flux came Redux and Yarn and Immutable and TypeScript and Prettier and all this crap, And now you have these like big debates, flow type over TypeScript, Webpack over Parcel. Like, what the fuck is going on, right? Like, we just constantly like, why are we doing this to ourselves? But we are, right? Even with like Redux, right? Like Redux sagas, loops, what are dunks? Like, there's like so many options to do the same thing. Like, how do you know which one to go with, right? How do you know which one will make you happy? I mean, the answer is none of them, but that's the life that we live. So what do you get when you take all that shit and make it easy, right? You get Reason. Whoops, my clicker stopped clicking. It doesn't want me to talk about Reason. Oh, my computer just froze. Nice. Okay, cool. Oh, we're back. All right. So you get Reason, right? Okay. So a little bit about Reason. It was created by the creator of React, right? Which is a big deal. People seem to overlook that. Familiar JavaScript syntax, right? On top of a battle-tested language and a super, super friendly compiler. Compiler, what's that, right? We have a just-in-time compiler, right? Like, we know when things work in the browser, right? So talk about a good feedback cycle. Can anybody guess what language React was originally written in 2010? Any guesses? Huh? Close enough, standard ML, right? So in 2010, Jordan Walk wrote React in standard ML, right? 2010. Like I mentioned earlier, I think in 2010, like I was like still using SourceForge, hoping I don't pull a script that has like some like, late version of a Bitcoin miner, like running, JavaScript for something. All I wanted to do was like change the transition of a CSS hover link, right? Like that's what 2010 was like, at least for me. So what is Reason? Like how do you define it? Like what's it for? Like the one-liner. So it's JavaScript as a statically typed functional language with a friendly compiler and amazing developer productivity. And the nice part about Reason, one thing that just like brings like so much like goodness to my life is if it compiles, it works, right? That was like a weird thing for me to experience. You know what I mean? It's just like, it was weird. It feels good just even thinking about it, right? Like, oh, like this works, this compiles. I don't have to worry about it. I'm not up at 2 o'clock in the morning wondering if, the thing that I shipped last night was going to, fucking blow up at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? So what is OCaml, right? So Reason is built on top of OCaml, right? And if you haven't heard of OCaml, OCaml is usually like the language that you like fuck around with for a semester in college because you have to take a compilers class and hope you never deal with again, right? That is like old school OCaml, I suppose. You can write OCaml in a variety of ways, and the way that Reason introduces OCaml to you is like a fun, cool way, not this like mindfuck what is going on way, right? So don't give up on it just yet. Anyway, OCaml is a functional programming language with 20 years of type theory, right? We're all getting excited about TypeScript and all this new crap that we're doing, right? OCaml's been doing it forever. We get powerful pattern matching, like functions as a first-class citizen, and a robust ecosystem of packages called OPAM, right? So OPAM is how you would like fetch things from, like their version of NPM. Luckily for us, Reason uses NPM, right? So you don't have to do much to get it to install, which I'll show you in a second here. So what are the benefits of Reason at a high level? Like what are the big selling points, like the headlines? It compiles at least 10 times faster than Babel. I'm being very nice here. I'll show you in a second. It eliminates typical JavaScript errors. There's no such thing as null or undefined in Reason, right? Things are either something or they're nothing, right? Like no weird, cannot read null of null, cannot read undefined of null, right? Like those things just don't happen. It's easy to integrate with your existing JavaScript app. You don't have to start a new project and turn it into Reason. You can bolt Reason onto a JavaScript project. You can bring JavaScript into your Reason project. And the compiled code is easy to debug. One of the highlights of this whole ecosystem is that the creators really wanted to make it easy, right? If you've ever had to debug any sort of compiled code, it's usually a nightmare, right? The closest thing we have to that in the JavaScript world is source maps, which are, problematic as a whole, right? So the compile times are really, really fast. Somebody tweeted about this, right? So, some basic hello world thing in Scala like takes 5 seconds, right? Like Rust is up there too. TypeScript even managed to do it in 1.8 seconds. And then like OCaml is doing it in like 0.02, right? But I know that's not enough to sell you, right? So like this is like a real world project. This is our Draftbit builder, right? So I'm running yarn start on the left-hand side, which is create React app, and then Reason on the right-hand side, right? And it's just like done. That's like completely like fresh, right? Starting the development server, it took another 10 seconds, but the GIF was getting too big, so I had to cut it short, right? So the differences are extraordinary. It's so hard to go back to writing JavaScript just waiting for that thing to reload. It's just like, oh, compiling, like, okay, and Reason's already like, so much further ahead. Now, the sort of messages that we get from the compiler are really friendly, right? Maybe you've used Elm before, right? Like Elm's like got the same sort of goals where we just want to make the messages that are coming back like intuitive, helpful, right? Like some sort of hint, right? When you're debugging JavaScript in the browser, right? Like you get this like red box that pops up that says something's wrong, right? And you click it, and sometimes it opens up your editor, and sometimes it freezes, and then you got to restart your computer. You know, like that's what like debugging JavaScript is like for me. But this, like before the browser even refreshes, I know immediately what's going on, right? In this case, this is some sort of like pattern matching issue, right? Where I have like a certain amount of cases, and I'm not matching for one of them. And the compiler just lets me know, like, hey, you forgot to match a case. Like, this could be a problem for you, right? It's a warning, so I'll compile, but just letting you know, like, shit might hit the fan, you know, if this case matches, right? So it's just like, oh, okay, cool. You know, like, I'll just match that. Okay, so we are talking about React. What does a React component in Reason look like? Well, it's pretty familiar to what you're doing, right? Like, JSX already exists in Reason. There are some differences, right? One thing like this, right? You see this like destructuring, or not destructuring, but this decorator thing like sitting at the top here. Close, but different, right? Like it's close enough. Something you'll also notice too is this, right? React.string, right, in a function running it, right? Well, the cool parts is all your JSX is typed, right? There is no uncertainty, right? We all know what uncertainty does to a code base, right? Like we want to know what's going on at every step of the way, right? Because otherwise, like this is what life is like, right? And that does a really good job of defining a web developer's role in the JavaScript ecosystem, right? So there are some cool things that you could do with those types, right? One thing that Reason offers is this thing called pipe first, right? So in this case, we have a string called hey there, and then we're piping it to something. So before, you saw me running this as a function, right? But everything is a function in Reason. So instead, I can just pipe that data to this thing, right? And the nice thing about that is it makes it super easy to read composable functions. Have you ever had this? This is pretty familiar. This happens in JavaScript all the time, right? And we've created tools and functions that help us, right? Like compose. GraphQL and Apollo expose it. Recompose exposes it. You can write it in one line too, right? It's a nice thing to do it. But the thing with compose is it actually reverses the order in which you want things, right? So then, you know, like you'll use like compose right or whatever it's called. I forget. It's escaping me. Anyway, what pipe first does is it lets you display that same data in a way that makes sense, right? This is like really easy to just sort of grok and figure out what's going on here, right? And then when you're debugging things too, right, you can just like comment it out and like the structure of your code stays the same. Have you ever tried to debug something where you want to like get rid of like one little thing and then maybe like everything just kind of shits the fan and you got to like, you know, like move the curlies around and make it work, right? Like, you don't have to deal with that here, right? Like, it just keeps things in order, right? Especially with prettier. Do people use prettier here in the room, right, for code formatting, right? If you don't, you know, I mean, you're still arguing about tabs and spaces and semis or not, strongly suggest to check it out. Those problems will go away. But anyway, you'll comment something out in prettier and it reformats everything and you're like, ah, fuck, you know, like, well, let me just like Command Z this, get it the way I want it to, and move on, right? But this does a good job of just keeping everything together. So let's go over like a more complex example. In my experience so far, this is as complex as like the typed JSX is getting, right? So before I break this down, let's go over it. 1, 2, 3, in this case is a list, right? It looks like an array, but Reason has these things called lists, which I'll go over in a second here. And then I call belt.list.map, right? So the map part is familiar, right? And then I turn that list into an array, right? And then I turn that array into a React component, right? So that's what's going on here. All right. So what is a list? And what's the differences between arrays? Reason supports both lists and arrays, right? But lists are immutable, they're homogeneous, and they're super, super fast, right? To make an array work in Reason, you would put 2 brackets around it, right? Right now, lists are a first-class citizen, but I think what's going on is they're going to be switching it around and making arrays a first-class citizen for ReasonReact, because nobody likes this process of like having to do this 3-step thing for a list, right? Okay, so Belt. What's Belt? Belt is a standard library that's shipped with Reason, right? You can use it. You don't have to use it. You can also access the JS libraries that you're used to, right? Like map and find and filter and all those things. Or you can use Reason standard library, which is like super optimized and super nice, right? It's sort of like using Lodash, right? But just for Reason. JavaScript doesn't have a standard library. You can call Lodash that standard library, right? So it's nice having something with like a tool chest of things that I use commonly, right? Okay, so going back to this. Now I'm taking that immutable list and converting it into an array, right? And why is that important? Because the browser doesn't know what a list is, right? It knows what an array is, but it doesn't know what a list is, right? And then lastly, I convert it into a React element, right? And that's what you see on the screen. And that last function is what calls React.createElement. It knows the data structure of what's going in, right? JavaScript's JSX does not. So you get a little bit of safety there. It makes that whole process a lot easier. Okay, hooks are the future. I did not want to believe this for a while. You know, like I really liked functional components. I liked where things were going. I used classes. But hooks are the future. And Reason has made that clear, because you don't have any other option but to use hooks as of last week. But I've learned to love them, right? Have people used hooks here with React? Is that, you know, like, are you experimenting? Do you like hooks? Is it cool or no? Or, you know, you can tell me to fuck off too. Anyway, what does that look like? Okay, so this is what a React hooks component looks like. You still has the decorator at the top, right? You have your make function, which is just sort of like writing a function, right? And now you've got your let count, set count is equal to react.useState, right? So in JavaScript, that count and set count would be an array, right? And then you have like 0 and 1 index would be, you know, your state, and then something to update that state, some sort of name, right? In this case, this is a tuple, right? What are tuples? They're immutable, ordered, and heterogeneous, which means you can pass in whatever you want, and it'll just know how to deal with it, right? In this case, an example of a tuple is, you know, we've got this like type of coordinates, right? They're both floats, right? So the coordinates for Chicago are, you know, 4188 and 8762, right? We can also destructure those tuples. So if I wanted to access that directly, I can destructure the same way that I'm used to in JavaScript, with, you know, like some intricacies of syntax, right? Okay. Something else that I want to go over is pattern matching, right? So in this case, what we have is a use reducer. I was going to put up the whole thing, but I think it's easier to read this chunk, right? Imagine this in like a bigger component with some divs and spans or whatever, right? But this is just that one part, right? So we have our tuple of state and dispatch, right? We use the use reducer hook, which is sort of like Redux built into React now, right? And what we're doing is we're calling a switch statement, right, on some action. In this case, that action is tick, right? And you'll notice something about this, right? Like, first, tick is capitalized, right? Second, the switch statement looks a little weird, right? It looks a little goofy. A lot of things that look similar but are different, right? Pattern matching in Reason is a switch statement on steroids. It makes the whole process just make more sense, right? This is something that we're used to, right? This is as close to vanilla JavaScript as it gets, right? We have this like let message is equal to sup, and then we pass that message through and wait for it to match, right? In this case, it doesn't match, so it's going to return what's good, right? The cool thing about switch statements in Reason is that you can assign a variable to them, you know? What I usually do in JavaScript is make a function out of this, right? And then get like the sort of like immutable sort of effect that I want, right? But in this case, I can just do this, and it's great. Okay, now, going back to this whole tick thing, why is tick capitalized? What's going on here, right? Tick is not a string, it's a constructor, right? And it all kind of plays really well with this concept called variance, right? In this case, we've got a variant. We've got this like my response variant, and it's either yes or no or pretty much, right? So variants offer a super powerful way of representing complex data structures, right? You don't just have to say it's got to be, one thing. It could be a variety of different things, right? So in this case, if we just removed those strings and used variants instead, or constructors, right, you're matching against something a little more specific, a little more driven the way that Reason and OPAM will want you to. And the cool thing about it is, in like a real world setting, if you were using Reason, you'd be using constructors with arguments. And here's like a common pattern, right? You've got some data coming back from the server, right? Your first case is an error, right? The switch through the message in that response, right? And just oops, like something went wrong, right? You've got a loading state, right? So if it's loading, like whatever, you've got your loading indicator or some text or some way of letting the user know. And lastly, success, right? You'd pass data most likely or something, right? But in this case, our data's name, so you just like render it, right? And you've got 3 distinct cases, right? And in this case, my response variant could be error with a message, loading with no variable, and lastly, success. It takes in a variable of data. In this case, data is your name, right? Cool. So now let's take things up a notch, right? So we've got our simple functional component here. It takes an argument, right? Our last function didn't. You'll notice a new decorator that lives on top of that called genType. genType is one of my favorite parts of Reason and this ecosystem because it lets you generate bindings between JavaScript and Reason very, very easily. And what I mean by that is I can import greeting from components /greeting.gen. You'll notice the gen thing, right? Every file has a bs.js or gen.js extension. And before genType, I had to manually write those bindings, right? So I would say, greeting has an argument called name, and that name needs to be a string, and it can't be optional, right? It's got to be required, right? And then you do this like sort of, not tedious, but it was tedious compared to writing the component, right? But now you don't have to. And the cool thing is genType supports TypeScript and FlowType. And what I mean by that is if you've already got a TypeScript project and you want to introduce Reason into it, you write out your component in Reason, it'll generate the perfect type for that component, right? I'm still a FlowType person. I drank the Facebook Kool-Aid. And like there's a lot of things here that you wouldn't do in FlowType, right? Or like you wouldn't know to do, right? Like the plus in front of the name, right? Or like the 2 lines between the brackets, right? Those pipes, which means it must be an exact object, right? Most of us just write it without those pipes, right? I've learned more about FlowType through genType generating types for me than I have reading the documentation. So it's cool. It makes life so much easier, right? So if you're having a hard time selling your team on Reason, build a few things, right? Build some basic components, put the genType decorator on there, and expose them to it. Look, I wrote this component in Reason. You have amazing types generated for you already. Just go ahead and use it. You don't have to know what's behind that black box, right? Just use it. And that sort of, goes along with, can I use my existing JavaScript components in Reason? Yes, you can, right? You can. And you can do it everywhere, right? That's one of the best parts of Reason is Jordan did not want you to have to go out of your way to make it work, right? The process of onboarding is super, super seamless, right? The weird thing is, this looks like a lot. It looks like a lot's going on, right? So I'm using genType at the top, right, which is like a decorator again. You'll see that syntax a lot, right? And I'm importing this JavaScript file that lives next to whatever. So if I had like a greeting.js file, I would probably call this greeting.re, right? Just to keep things one-to-one, right? Simple naming conventions. And all I really have to do here is pass in the variables, right? So Reason has this idea of labeled arguments. See that little see that little squiggly in front of show and in front of message, right? That's sort of like writing a JavaScript object, right? Instead of just passing in plain variable names, right? Like variables aren't named in functions in JavaScript, so we use objects to make that whole thing easier, right? But this, we've got like labels, so that's how we do that. And we've got a Boolean, and we've got an optional message, right? The stuff below, ReasonReact, component, stateless, no retained props, actionless, that's more or less boilerplate, you know? Which means that like it's only a matter of time that all this will be automated. And I know for sure it'll be automated. It's not, I'm guessing, I know. So anyway, like that whole thing just makes it, you know, one less thing that I have to worry about, right? So it's cool. You know, Reason is cool, right? You know, it's cool, right? We're getting there. Anyway, how do I add Reason to my JavaScript project? Well, the process is super, super simple. And anyone can do it in like 15 minutes. So you add BS platform, right? Usually just set the exact version on this and just set it and forget it. You add a BS config file. BS config is like your package.json, but for the Reason ecosystem, right? I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then some script tags, right? Like yarn re watch, yarn re build, right? And that's about it. So the BS config file looks a little bit like this, right? Most of this is boilerplate. This is literally all boilerplate except for the name, right? So you could just like find this file, place it in your project, and it just works, right? We'll see what changes about this file. I don't think much. It's been this case for 3 years now, you know, but I imagine if that file's there, it will have a specific, you know, app-related purpose one day. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how all of this plays together. How does Reason and OCaml work together? How do we get JavaScript out of it, right? So we have Reason, right, which are these .re, rei files. We have OCaml, which I've also used the ML extension, right? You can interchange Reason and OCaml in a project, right? And what we get is the OCaml AST, right? That sort of consumes all of this, right? And then we have a few different ways of going, right? So the beautiful part about all this is that you can write Reason, you can write OCaml. It goes through the same AST, but you get 3 different really, really nice targets, right? So you get bytecode, right? Super, super fast. You get native code, right? We're talking, we're about a year or 2 away from writing React Native apps using React and Reason primitives and just giving you a native process with no JavaScript, right? So an ecosystem that you're already familiar with now will just give you a bundled IPA or APK file with no bridge, with no sort of bottlenecks, right? And just using an ecosystem that you're already familiar with, right? And lastly, JavaScript, right? And this is the part we're going to focus on right now. And how do we do that? We do that through BuckleScript. So BuckleScript is actually separate from OCaml, right? Or from Reason. BuckleScript was created by Bloomberg, right? For trying to make JavaScript as readable and as friendly as possible, right? So BuckleScript came way, way before Reason ever did. And the goals of BuckleScript are to write safer, simple, readable code that compiles to JavaScript, right? The compiled code is readable. More readable than you would think, right? Like especially if you've ever used anything like CoffeeScript or ClojureScript, right? Or any variety of these tools. They don't do a very good job of it, right? We get like the pile of mud, right? This ball of mud, if you've heard that phrase before, where there's like no architecture, it's kind of all over the place, right? BuckleScript does a really good job of solving that issue. So we've got FizzBuzz here. This is like the easiest way to write it in Reason. I know there's a lot going on, but you know, just a handful of lines, FizzBuzz, FizzBuzz, right? We pattern match against some modifiers, right? And then return some sort of string, right? What does that look like straight from the BuckleScript compiler? It looks like this, which maybe at first seems a little strange. What's up, you know, with the $sign up there? But it really isn't, you know? And the nice part is, a lot of this was already optimized for you. More optimized than you would by hand, right? So you wouldn't necessarily be looking at these files. You wouldn't be checking in these files either, right? But if you need to debug, if you want to find out how they do it, right, it's available for you, right? And this is what like the bs.js file would look like. Here's a simple factorial, just a quick one-liner, right? Now, what does that look like on the JavaScript side? So we import something from the OCaml standard library, right? You can get away without doing it, but the example was a lot easier to have it in there. And this is pretty simple, right? This is pretty readable, right? I didn't do anything with this. I didn't do anything with this. I didn't format it. I didn't make it look nicer, right? This is exactly what it spit out, which is really nice, right? I could make sense of this. If I need to debug something going wrong, it's really easy to figure out, what I'm doing. Okay, so the compiled JavaScript is always going to be faster outside or within the BuckleScript ecosystem. A lot faster too, right? Unless you are some genius person who knows how to move bits or whatever in JavaScript, you can't be BuckleScript. An immutable JS map, right? Let's just say the same example takes about 3.5 seconds to boot up. In Reason, that immutable map is a third of that, and now it's even faster. Tree shaking is fantastic because you know everything at compile time. Because BuckleScript is so integrated with these JavaScript primitives with the API, it knows exactly what you need and exactly what you don't, and can get rid of it, right? So you take something like immutable JS through Webpack, 55 kilobytes, right? 55 kilobytes with tree shaking and Webpack, and you use BuckleScript, and it's less than a kilobyte, right? 899 bytes. That's amazing, right? That's unheard of in our world. So there's some of the amazing benefits of Reason, right? And you're like, what? How is this possible, right? And like I mentioned, it's because BuckleScript has these deep integration with JS libraries, right? And there's a lot of them too. So there's the ones that belong directly in BuckleScript, and then there's the community ones too, right? So you can bind JavaScript to Reason on your own. You don't have to use anything off the shelf, right? And you do this with syntax that looks like this. So in this case, our decorator at the top is a little different, right? Now it says bs.val, right? So before it said react.component. In this case, we're talking to BuckleScript directly. We're creating an external function called addKeyboardEventListener. And that's got a type of a string. It's got the type of a keyboard event, right? And it returns unit named addEventListener, right? So I know there's a lot going on here. We're not going to unpack all this, right? But this is like a one-liner that you could just throw into your code base and then use the addEventListener thing, right? The reality of it is types and bindings are the hardest part, right? I think I've done a pretty good job of selling Reason, maybe not, please tell me if not. But this is the hardest part about it. Getting bindings, getting types to work correctly are a nightmare, But the nice part is there's types and bindings for literally every library. Express, Node, the web, the DOM, Redux if you still want to use it, Apollo, Emotion, styled components, React obviously, right? There are thousands of them, right? There are people that have figured out the secret to these and can write them. And I'm not saying this is impossible either. It's just really, really hard. So just use what's off the shelf until you're super, super comfortable with it. Okay. Now, is Reason ready for production? Yes. The answer is yes. And a lot of companies are using it in production, right? Companies shipping Reason today, Bloomberg, Messenger.com is 100% Reason. And they've done some amazing case studies with it. Right? Super, super fast and fluid. Accenture, McKinsey & Company, Jane Street, and obviously Draftbit. I had to put myself up there. And many more, right? That's just a small list. There's hundreds of big companies that you've heard of using Reason, right? It just makes sense. It's built for people that want to move quickly, that want to rely on something, right? So it's nice. So where can I learn more, right? We have a meetup in Chicago called the ReasonML meetup. We meet once a month on Wednesdays. Please come by. We're a very friendly and cool crowd. There's about 10 of us that show up every week or every month, and we just sit down and work through problems together. The ReasonML Discord, just Google it. There's a ton of people, super, super smart individuals that are working on it. You'll see Cheng Liu and Jordan Walk, the big creators of React, hanging out and answering questions all day long, right? They're really trying to build a community out of it. So don't feel weird, joining it. It's fun. And then there's a Reason conference coming up in the US, in Chicago, in October. This is kind of a big deal. So Jordan Walk will be keynoting the event for the first time since releasing React in 2013 at JSConf, right? So if you are in the React ecosystem, this is a really, really big deal. You can just do reasonconf.us to get more info about that. Remember when React was coming out, right? People hated it. HTML inside JavaScript. Why would I ever do that? All I have to say is, don't be that person. You know, give Reason a shot, right? React blew up, and there's a good chance Reason will too. So give it a go. Play around with it. You know, let me know what you think too. Thank you so much, everybody. You've been the best audience ever. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it was interesting to you. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram and GitHub, and same with Draftbit. Thank you so much.